In a time not so long ago, in a place not so far away, there was a small hamlet nestled in a valley between two mountains. The population was small, but the people tried to keep the laws of the land as best they could. But every day the mayor of the village would annotate the grievances of anyone who came, because once a month a magistrate would come from the capital, a large, well-leafed tome under his arm, which held the laws to be followed. And the people would gather together, and their grievances would be heard. And the magistrate would look up his book and give a response according to what it said. Sometimes the people were quite dissatisfied, thinking that what had been said was too lenient or maybe too harsh, but they followed what was said by the magistrate because, after all, these were the laws. But one day the magistrate came with his book under his arm, but instead of sitting down and placing it on the table in front of him, he stood and he said, "The king has said that it has been decided that your village is too small to warrant my attendance, so I will not be coming any more." And with that he took his book and left, leaving the villagers aghast, speaking amongst themselves. What were they to do? So the mayor, standing up, gathered some of the elders, the old, the considered wise men, and took them aside to discuss what could be done. But sitting around a little pot-bellied stove, because the time was quite cool, there was lots of disagreement as to what was possible to be done. But as it happened, an old woman who cared for that place, old in years and old in wisdom, came in to serve cups of tea and tend the pot-belly's stove. And as she listened to each person having their say, she clicked her tongue a little bit in disagreement, until finally, in a moment of silence, she asked, "May I speak?" And so, nodding agreement, the old men allowed her to have her voice. And she said, "The laws are not to be found in the books. The laws are to be found in the hearts of men. And when they learn to listen, they will know." But in the moment of silence that followed, as the men digested these words, someone spoke up and said, "But who will judge whether it's truth or untruth?" The old woman said, "May I tell you a story?" And on the nods of agreement, She sat down and made herself comfortable and began her story. She said there was a town somewhat like our own, where the people did not know how and what to follow. So gathering together, they decided, and together they erected 4 stout poles, putting a canopy over the top, and some benches around the edges. They installed a large bell with a long rope which reached the ground. And it was put out there that anyone who had a grievance would ring the bell, and the people would gather to listen. And so it was. At first the bell rang almost constantly. The people sat around and listened. And soon the bell did not ring as often as before, because people had learned to listen and have respect for one another. But in that village, on a hill nearby, up a winding road, there stood a palatial mansion owned by the richest merchant in town. He was somewhat of a hermit. He kept to himself amongst his treasured belongings, his house filled with antiques and precious objects. But his most treasured possessions were his horses. In a building as palatial as his house, there were stalls filled with magnificent steeds, except one stall that was waiting for the perfect horse. Now this man's name was Domazir, and Domazir could look down at the village to see what was happening. He knew the bell was there, he heard it ring, but he didn't mix with the people there. He left them to their affairs. But one day, a ship came into the small harbour, and out of the bottom of that ship came a magnificent stallion, dapple grey, with ivory mane and tail, clambering up the plank to the land, shaking itself after its long confinement. It reared, frisky after being held so long. 2 men were hardly able to rein it in as they led it into the town square. But suddenly the great stallion reared up and broke away from the men who were holding it, and began a dash. It dashed up the road, up the winding road that led to the house of the merchant, who, it happened, was standing on his veranda watching, seeing this magnificent beast gallop its way up the road. He opened his door, and when the stallion reached his house. It dashed into the house, its great hooves smashing things around it. But Domazir approached the stallion, gently patting its muzzle, and in doing so, enabling him to catch the reins which had been dangling as it galloped. After a moment or two, Domazir was able to climb on to the magnificent beast and let it have its head. It dashed out of the door, and Domazir could feel the wind as it whipped his face and sent the mane and tail of the horse flying. It was totally exhilarating. He had never experienced such wild delight in his life. And shouting as the wind whipped by, he said, "I'm going to call you Catch the Wind." So the great stallion, Catch the Wind, became the possession of Domazir, finding its place in the stall that had awaited it. Almost every day Domazir would climb on to catch the wind, and they would go out into the fields and in places they hadn't been before. But then one day, after a wild ride, Domazir was riding Catch the Wind through a small forest when they were beset by robbers with sabres, knives, bows and arrows, 3 of them riding, several on foot. There was a great foray that went on. Catch the Wind's hooves flying in all directions as he worked to save his master, Domazir. Finally, the bandits were vanquished, and Domazir rode Catch the Wind back to his mansion. But when he alighted, he found that Catch the Wind had a great gaping wound in his flank, blood pouring down from this open wound. He was horrified, calling his stable hand. They stemmed the flow as best they could. Domazir slept in the stall that night, but the whinnying of pain of Catch the Wind was almost too much for him to bear. But he and his stable hand cared for the wound, which was slow healing. But after some time, it did take place, but left a great jagged scar along the flank of the great stallion. Domazir daily went to check on Catch the Wind, and one day when the wound had healed, it seemed that it was time to again ride. So taking Catch the Wind, he rode but found that soon the great stallion tired. He was not the same as he was before. Something happened also to Domazir. After a while, he could not bear to go to the stables any more. Each time he saw the jagged scar, pain was in his chest, and soon he stopped going. Catch the Wind languished in his stall, and finally Domazir gave instructions to let him go to pasture, to let him free. Catch the wind running free in the meadows, missed his master. And one day, when he saw an open gate, he left. Catch the Wind was free. He went into the forests, and at first was able to find food. But then a long, cold winter came, and it was hard for the great stallion to find enough to eat. His mane became matted, his tail ragged, and his ribs showing through his sides. So he made his way into town to try to forage for food. And when he did, he started to paw around the ground in the center of the square where the great bell hung. And as he was pawing the ground, he pulled the rope that rang the bell. People heard its sound, and coming out of their houses, putting on their coats and their capes and their shawls, they came to see who was ringing the bell. When they came to the square, they recognized that it was a horse. And someone said, "Why, it's Catch the Wind." And someone said, "But how do you know?" And they replied, "Well, I was a stable hand with its master." And he told the tale of what had happened with the great stallion. And all the people agreed that Domazir should be called. So 2 of the men of the village made their way up the road to Domazir's mansion. When they arrived there, surprisingly, the one who answered their knock was Domazir himself. The 2 men said, "You are called to the square." And Domazir asked why, and they said, "It's about your horse." So Domazir knew that he had to answer this call. So accompanying the 2 men, they came to the town square, and a spokesman among them said, "This is your horse. Catch the wind." Of course, he was hardly recognizable, ribs showing, tail and mane matted. What a pitiful sight. But the people said to Domazir, "You must take care of your horse." And in that moment, Domazir knew, even though he looked at this once great stallion, and with his skin, as always before, prickling as he saw the jagged scar on its side, knew what he must do. So taking the rein of the great horse, Catch the Wind, he made his way back to his house. Installing Catch the Wind in its stall, he followed the instructions of those who had gathered around. "This is your horse. You must take care of him. Not your stable boy, not your servant. You." And he knew. He called his stable boy to him, asking him, "Please show me how I can make mash to feed my horse." Taking the brush, he carefully and gently began to comb the mane and tail. Gently, he went over the scar, over the ribs of this great being. And day after day, he spent time caring in all ways, growing closer and closer, so that the scar, the jagged scar, no longer caused his hairs to prickle. The fear rise up that was there when they were beset by the robbers. And soon Catch the Wind was restored to health. When he was touched, he quivered with life. And one day, Domazir decided to climb on this great beast. And together they went out and felt the wind in their hair and their mane and their tail. And as soon as Domazir felt even a twinge of fatigue, being now one with this great animal, he alighted and led Catch the Wind back to be cared for again. In the end, as the old woman finished her story, the mare of the town and the elders who had gathered said, "Come, let us gather the people, not to hear grievances, not to give advice, but to listen." The question that arises from this story is obvious. What does this great stallion represent for us? What's the meaning of this story?
Our heart gets broken and we stop listening, we have to learn to listen again.
Just like every element, every character, every symbol, every archetype in every story is part of our self. What is life for us now? What is this? Stella. What does it mean to listen? What does listening do? What are we listening to?